and I teach in the English department. Thanks for coming out on this dreary night. I'm here to introduce Rafael Campo, our guest. It's not often that you can introduce someone who has seen you naked. Rafael Campo is not only a critically acclaimed poet, but he's also my doctor. When I schedule my annual checkups, our meetings at his Beth Israel clinic range from tips for dealing with a sore throat or intermittent insomnia to our lives as creative writers and teachers. These small indentations in my daily life are a welcome combination of empathy and wisdom, the same empathy and wisdom that informs all of Rafael's work. In a recent interview, he says, "Empathy is so central to both types of work. Poetry really is a version of another voice. It's the story or the narrative of another person or the speaker. Similarly, in medicine, you have to be able to enter into the stories of your patients and to listen carefully to what they tell you about their symptoms." In one of my favorite sonnets, Towards Curing AIDS, the speaker of the poem is a young doctor administering a lapidary to his patient. We can ask Rafael what a lapidary is later. Another colleague of the speaker, a stubborn vocal physician, refuses care to her patient and catches the speaker's attention. My patient's eyes are overhearing her. He doesn't wince. His corner bed inters him even now, as she does. He hasn't died, but he will. Here the poet, Here the poet indicts not only the obstinate physician in the room with him, but the patient, the reader, and even himself. I close the wound, the drain is repositioned. Needles in his veins, I leave him pleading. There's too much to do. Over the past week, teaching a few of Rafael's sonnets from his first collection, The Other Man Was Me, I was impressed once again with the way that Rafael takes traditional verse forms and in that old Ezra Pound line makes it new. And it was my also acute Boston College students who pointed to Rafael's subtle modifications of the sonnet. His variations on traditional rhyme scheme, the iambic pentameter, which Sue Roberts has explained to me many times. I'm a fiction writer by trade, and the emotional nature of the sonnet's form. On his own use of forms, Rafael has said, "I would say of the sonnet that no other way of writing poetry so completely mirrors what I discover in my patients, occupying of their physical bodies. The undercurrent of ions in the beating heart and breathing lungs, the gorgeousness of rhyme akin to dressing up the body in layers of clothes, the replication of the same patterns across centuries, a kind of literary genetics." Rafael Campo teaches and practices internal medicine at Harvard Medical School and Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston. His honors are nothing to scoff at. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, an honorary doctorate of literature degree from Amherst College, a National Poetry Series Award, a Lambda Literary Award for his poetry, and his third collection of poetry, Diva, which was published by Duke University Press in 2000, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. His most recent book, Landscape with Human Figure, also published by Duke University, won the gold medal from Forward for the best book of poetry published by an independent press. His work has been selected for numerous Best American Poetry and Pushcart Prize anthologies, and I'll just mention a few. Los Angeles Times, The Nation, the New York Times Magazine, the Paris Review, which is something we should all aim for as emerging writers. In August 2003, W.W. Norton published a new prose work, The Healing Art, A Doctor's Black Bag of Poetry, Essays on Poetry and Medicine. Dr. Jerome Groopman, writing in the New York Times Book Review, says of his work, "It is valuable and moving. He's undaunted by the ugliness of the physical deterioration apparent before his eyes, seeking always to capture the beauty of the human soul in struggle with physical reality." The New York Times called The Desire to Heal reminiscent of Chekhov in the way language comes up out of the body. And the poet Sidney Lea, in the Hudson Review, says of Landscape with Human Figure, "Hope figures prominently in this impressive collection. Campo chooses ritual gatherings not to celebrate our alienations, but our commonality, in which, for the good doctor, hope resides. Rafael Campo is inevitably a poet of which there's going to be a short break for those who wish to leave, followed by a Q&A period, so keep that in mind. He'll also be signing copies of his books following the reading, just right outside. Is that right, Paul? On a similar note, we wanted to acknowledge Rafael's generous donation of half of his stipend for tonight's lecture to BC's lesbian, gay, and bisexual and transgender group, BC Allies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Poet and friend Rafael Campo.
Wow, that was a very kind introduction, Rico. I'm going to give you something special at your next physical. We'll talk about that later. So I thought I would start tonight with a poem that has to do with my chief themes for this evening, which are poetry and healing and the relationship between those two things, which many of my colleagues in medicine think sometimes doesn't really exist. And I thought in trying to invoke this connection, I might start with a poem that addresses the kind of wound that perhaps medicine is not terribly well equipped to address, which is the kind of wound that occurred on September 11, 2001, the attacks on the World Trade Center. And I remember after those terrible events, how many of my patients actually responded to what had happened with storytelling in one form or another. Some of them actually wrote poems themselves. And this is a poem of my own that I wrote in response to those events. And again, I think it really, in some ways perhaps, helps us to begin to think about how poetry, how words might be useful in healing. This is a poem called The Enemy. The building's wounds are what I can't forget. Though nothing could absorb my sense of loss, I stared into their blackness, what was not supposed to be there, billowing of soot and ragged maw of splintered steel, glass. The building's wounds are what I can't forget. The people dropping past them, fleeting spots approaching death as if concerned with grace. I stared into the blackness, what was not inhuman, since by men's hands they were wrought. Reflected on the TV screen, my face upon the building's wounds. I can't forget this rage. I don't know what to do with it. It's in my nightmares, towers, plumes of dust, a staring in the blackness. What was not conceivable is now our every thought. We fear the enemy is all of us. The building's wounds are what I can't forget. I stared into their blackness, what was not. I always feel like I'm such a fortunate beneficiary of the hospitality of people when I go around different places and give readings for my work, and being here at BC is no different. And I thought I'd read next a poem that, to my mind, has something to do with this notion of hospitality. And whenever I think of hospitality, also I'm reminded of the place where I spend most of my time, the hospital, a place which obviously has something in its name to do with hospitality, although I think we forget that a lot in medicine. And hospitality is important to me also because I'm the child of immigrant parents who came to this country, and I think really had a tremendous experience of hospitality here, and really I think would want me to sort of reflect that back to you in welcoming you in a sense into the home of my poems. And so this is a poem that I wrote when I was in an unfamiliar place where perhaps hospitality was somewhat lacking, and it's called Outside Fayetteville. Come north to harvest strawberries and corn. I wonder what this family of 4 disheveled Mexicans must think of us. They buy a few things at the corner store, outside of which are parked 2 pickups, one displaying Dixie's stars and bars inside the cab's rear window. Never looking up, the little girl, perhaps in school, has learned already something that it says about her place. Her father, still an immigrant, regards it with a curiosity, a kind of hopeful sympathy that seems to ask, what country have you fled, and why? A black man walks along the road beneath a billboard advertising Southern pride. He's shirtless in the blazing midday heat and pauses in the shade afforded by the giant cutout rippling emblem. Sweat is dripping off him like a baptism, the ritual absolving us of what we never should forget. The sky glares white above the bold-faced new economy, the promise of another better day when all, God willing, shall be judged not by the color of their skin, but by their clout. The black man, slowly moving onward, gleams. Rico mentioned that I am a physician, which I admit openly and honestly, but before I became a physician, I really thought I wasn't really a likely candidate for success in the medical profession, and that had to do with a number of things about me, actually. And I remember thinking first, when I had this dream of going to medical school, that my faith would be an issue, and I really didn't see much in the way of spiritual life or religious life among physicians, and I thought that was perhaps a kind of obstacle for me as I thought about the profession myself. And that, of course, was the fact of my ethnicity, and unfortunately I didn't really have much in the way of Latino role models to inspire me to a career in medicine, so I thought that would be another kind of problem for me as I made my way through the training. And then, of course, was the fact that I'm gay, and unfortunately I'd experienced a fair amount of homophobia in doctors' offices at a pretty young age, and I thought perhaps that would be the biggest kind of obstacle to me in trying to become a physician myself. And then, of course, when I actually finally did get to Harvard Medical School, it was the fact that I was a poet that was such a problem. All these other things that I'd been so worried about turned out, they were issues, but they weren't, such a big deal. But being a poet, now that was really freaky. That was like unheard of and scary, and I always tell that little story with a sense of irony because really I think my work as a poet and my engagement with language has so enriched my work with my patients that I can't imagine doing the work of a physician without the presence of poetry, without really thinking about stories and narratives in really every day in my interactions with my patients. So on that note, I'll read a little bit of a longer poem called The Failure of Empathy on Center Street, which in some ways perhaps locates me in relation to some of these identities. And in the poem you'll see a little bit of I guess I should say my former neighborhood, since I recently moved away from Jamaica Plain. So in Boston I don't have to probably explain too much about JP. Most of you may know it or have at least heard about it. So this is The Failure of Empathy on Center Street. On Center Street, one finds it all. The art of Africa, a lesbian cafe, the Cuban Puerto Rican mini-mart, and even past the post office, lilacs drooped by heavy blooms, their fragrance everywhere. It's spring in Boston, in this neighborhood that has a name part tropical, but skewed Midwest, Jamaica Plain, which sounds as odd as what I've gathered in these bags for lunch. Tostones, sushi, flavor of the day, one scoop from JP Licks, and a huge bunch of blushing grapes. So plentiful, yet scarce what one can find on Center Street. It's all the poor can do to feed themselves from what I might discard. A woman in a shawl that looks Peruvian stares hungrily my way and calls in Spanish with her stoic voice. She's stationed just beside the lilacs, holds a clutch of single roses wrapped in gold-fringed cellophane. The prostitute with AIDS, her name is Gloria, I think. She asked me for a sandwich once, some apple juice, ducks quick behind a dumpster, smoking crack, as plentiful as ever on the street. One really can get anything right here on Center Street. AIDS, frozen yogurt, pills, a bunch of seedless grapes, a can of beer, a rose in cellophane for 50 cents. A homeboy blasting rap outside the bank is waiting for his test results, perhaps. The clinic, which is free next door, still lacks the space for waiting rooms with ambiance more hip and private than the safer sex meets velveteen of chairs in crowded halls with tacked-up posters. Wondering what's next, I chew my sushi sullenly and think, what did we see in Center Street? It's all much older dykes who stay at home, and dark Dominicans and Mexicans who sell whatever they can get their hands on. AIDS is their disease these days, not ours. The men shoot drugs or sleep with prostitutes, then give it to their wives and kids. I want to move away from here until this anger fades. A bus groans by and belches fumes, a vast black comma, punctuation to my irk. It dissipates as promptly as it's passed, and when it's gone, I realize it then, that Center Street is anything but one community in isolation. All of us belong here. Any could be stunned by positive results, win lotteries, lose everything because the bank foreclosed. Impatiently, I count the languages I overhear, almost convinced the breeze that whistles gently through the lilacs is the single song that once was known, both sound and scent, the message unequivocal in its polite refusal to be drowned. Your heart is human. Never let it close. One of my jobs, I guess I would say, as now a faculty member at Harvard Medical School is to think about the ways in which literary writing and specifically poetry can be used as a kind of tool for modeling empathetic relationships between doctors or aspiring doctors and our patients. And one of the reasons that's so important to me is because during my own training I felt really a tremendous kind of absence of empathy. And in fact, I remember one of my supervisors during my training saying that I tended to identify too strongly with my patients, and that was going to be a problem for me when I became a doctor. And I really thought that was terribly damaging feedback to have, because at the time I was really trying to think about, what does it mean for another person to suffer, and how can I be a better witness? How can I be more present for some of these people who are often dying in front of my eyes? And so my response to that was to write a poem, which I think in some ways is a kind of definition of empathy. A lot of my colleagues say, well, you can't teach empathy anyway, or what is empathy? What does it mean? And it is, I think, hard to define, but this is a poem that tries in some ways to come up with a definition. It's called Aida. I've never met the guy next door. I know he's in there. Mud-caked shoes outside to dry. The early evening opera. The glow of candlelight. His window trades for night. I think he's ill, since once the pharmacy delivered his prescriptions to my door. Acyclovir, Dilantin, AZT. He doesn't go out running anymore. I've heard that he's a stockbroker who cheats a little on his taxes. Not in love, they say. He seems to live alone. I eat my dinner, hovering above my stove and wondering, why haven't we at least exchanged a terse hello or shaken hands? What reasons for his candlelight? His feet, I'm guessing by his shoes, are small. I can't imagine more. I'd like to meet him once, outside, without apartments, questions, shoes. I'd say that I'm in love with loneliness. I'd sing like candlelight. I'd sing the blues until we'd finished all the strawberries. We've never met, and yet I'm sure his eyes are generous, alive, like poetry but melting, brimming with the tears he cries for all of us. Aida, me, himself, all lovers who may never meet. My wall, as infinite and kind-faced as the wealth of sharing candlelight. It falls, it falls. I thought I would read next a poem for the writer, poet Marilyn Hacker. She was one of the first editors who actually ever published my work, actually in the Kenyon Review. And she herself, during her time there, was diagnosed with breast cancer. And sometimes when people ask me, well, why is it important to think about literature in relation to medicine, and some of those questions about empathy, I think about her work because I really think she's an example of a writer whose own engagement, imaginative engagement with her illness has really helped with her treatment. And she's actually doing tremendously well now, a number of years after her diagnosis. And I use her poems often, or I share her poems with patients of my own who are dealing with new diagnoses of cancer because they find them oftentimes to be just tremendously helpful to them. So I'll read this poem, as I often do, in honor of Marilyn, and it's called Allegory. Outside somewhere, beneath an atmosphere so pure and new, each breath is musical and silent, mouth-watering without taste, so full of butterflies one can't imagine because it hurts to be so free. Out there was a hospital where AIDS was cured with Chinese cucumbers and royal jelly, with herbal medicines, vaccines, colostrum. I went there in a submarine, through space it seemed, and I was armed with nuclear ICBMs. I read the New York Times, that's how relaxed and skeptical I was. I sat upon the floor, my back against my gleaming missiles. Strangely, no one else but me was on the submarine, except the president, whom I had confined beneath the lowest deck, inside somewhere where air was scarce and hardly breathable. One can't imagine what it's like to see a world like theirs from such a distance for the first time. God, was it beautiful. Butterflies and silent musical wind. The hospital where no one paid. I tried to give them smallpox, missiles, blankets. They looked at me like I was crazy, and they asked me why the president had been incarcerated. There's no explaining of morality to savages, I thought. And though it hurt to leave, to conquer them and take with me their royal jelly and colostrum, when I aimed my missiles at their hospital, I felt much better. Munching on a cucumber, the light of the explosion brightening my face, I couldn't help the tears. I was so sad and happy, all at once, again. That was a reference to the first President Bush. The Distant Moon. I wanted to read this poem, as I often do, for my own patients who I think really often have shown me, as they often show all of us in medicine, that they really take care of us better than we take care of them. And this particular patient who we'll meet in this poem was a wonderful example of that. He was someone who was always, when I would round on him in the hospital, always, sort of asking after me and my well-being. Did I have a decent breakfast that morning? Did I get enough sleep last night? When was I last, able to take a shower? He was really always, asking after me, and despite the fact that he was very ill himself, and he was actually a writer, and would put up with me on nights when I was on call, coming into his room, really late in the night, and reading first drafts of my own poems to him, which may sound like, but he was really generous, and so I always read this in his memory. He actually, very sadly, died not long after I finished my rotation. So what was for me a rotation was something very different for him. So this is called The Distant Moon. Admitted to the hospital again. The second bout of pneumocystis back in January almost killed him. Then he'd sworn to us he'd die at home. He baked us cookies, which the student wouldn't eat before he left. The kitchen on 5A is small, but serviceable and neat. He told me stories. Richard Gere was gay and sleeping with a friend of his, and AIDS was an elaborate conspiracy effected by the government. He stayed 4 weeks. He lost his sight to CMV. One day, I drew his blood, and while I did, he laughed and said I was his girlfriend now, his blood brother. "Vampire slut," he cried, "you'll make me live forever." Wrinkled brows were all I managed in reply. I know I'm drowning in his blood, his purple blood. I filled my 7 tubes. The warmth was slow to leave them, pressed inside my palm. I'm sad because he doesn't see my face, because I can't identify with him. I hate the fact that he's my age, and that across my skin he's there, my blood brother, my mate. He said I was too nice, and after all, if Jodie Foster was a lesbian, then doctors could be queer. Residual guilt tingled down my spine. "Okay, I'm done," I said as I withdrew the needle from his back and pressed. His CSF was clear. I never answered him. That spot was framed in sterile paper drapes. He was so near death, telling him seemed pointless. Then he died. Unrecognizable to anyone but me, he left my needles deep inside his joking heart. An autopsy was done. I read to him at night. His horoscope, the New York Times, The Advocate. Some lines by Richard Howard gave us hope. A quiet hospital is infinite. The polished, iced white floors, the darkened halls that lead to almost anywhere, to death or ghostly lighted Coke machines. I called to him one night, at home, asleep. His breath, I dreamed, had filled my lungs. His lips, my lips had touched. I felt as though I'd touched a shrine. Not disrespectfully, but in some lapse of concentration. In a mirror shines the distant moon. I read those poems now, and it seems like some things have changed and some things haven't changed very much at all. I thought I'd read next an excerpt from one of my essays, and whenever I come to a college campus, I'm reminded of Amherst College, my own alma mater, and some of you may know about Amherst. It's a wonderful place. It's in western Massachusetts, and kind of a small conservative college. And I remember when I was looking at colleges with my family, my brothers, of course, came along with us, and I remember visiting the quad and hearing some of the students there calling Amherst the fairest college, which they're very impressed with themselves there, and I can say that I think pretty honestly. And so I remember saying to my parents, "Gosh, I really think I want to go to Amherst." And my brothers, of course, who were perennially antagonistic, said, "Oh, the fairest college, that's the perfect place for you." And so I always think back to that and realize that my brothers, I think, knew something about me at that time in my life that I wasn't quite ready to admit myself. But in any event, I'm telling you all this because this essay is called The Fairest College. And I just want to read a few paragraphs of it. I should give you a sense of my life before I was a medical student, when I was actually a pre-medical student. So it's a long, long haul. But anyway, so this is from The Fairest College. I finally left the confines of suburbia, and after the now familiar 4-hour car ride, I arrived at Amherst, but this time I was one of her own. I was already becoming someone else, a different person. The sun seemed a bit less out of reach. At the freshman orientation barbecue, my parents hovered over my shoulder, eagerly pointing out details in the scenery and in the architecture, or solicitously offering to get me more of the watered-down pink lemonade, all the time avoiding what was the inevitable goodbye. Huge fists of smoke from the grilling steaks curled and rose in the air, dramatically giving shape to the growing resentment that began to boil in my blood. I was too indignant about my own efforts at coolness being spoiled to acknowledge either the strain in my mother's voice whenever she asked me a question, or the film of tears in her eyes when she studied the cornice at the top of a pillar. My father had assigned himself the special responsibility of spotting potential friends for me in the crowd, which I found especially irritating because his criteria apparently were 1, that they be male, 2, that they have short hair, and most important, 3, that they have a Spanish-sounding surname. This third criterion required him to approach each prospective candidate quite closely while staring at his chest as he tried to make out the lettering on the scrawled name tags. Pathetic, I thought. Even as he had spurred me on to reach so high an echelon in American culture, still he searched for the traces of his own lost culture, one I was glad to be rid of, that somehow might root me. After about 20 minutes of this behavior, I told him plainly that he was embarrassing me and pleaded with him to stop. I desperately wanted to blend in. I was actually working at being nondescript. Just then he shouted, squinting, "Look, over there! Jorge Arroyo!" enunciating the name clearly, rolling his R's beautifully, almost seductively. Now he looks like a nice guy. Why don't you go introduce yourself to him and find out whether he's in any of your pre-med classes? That was when I glimpsed the name tag myself, pinned to a colorful plaid madras shirt. As he walked by, his face turned towards an attractive woman with blonde hair who clung to his elbow. My father lunged to grab his shirt sleeve. I winced, yet he had not heard my father call out his name, and my father missed him by more than a few inches. When I had collected myself enough to speak, my voice was quietly and coolly irate. I stated that I would not select my friends solely on the basis of their ethnicity or their pre-professional choices, that I wanted to form friendships on the basis of shared interests and not presuppositions, and that I would make a point of not meeting this Jorge Arroyo, and for that matter, any other Latinos or pre-meds, precisely because he wanted me to do so. Looking utterly crestfallen, my father trailed off to get us some more lemonade, drained of all his vicarious excitement, not knowing that 10 years later he would be telling the same story gleefully, almost triumphantly, taking the credit even for first identifying the man with whom I've spent most of my adult life. That is a true story. If my parents were here, or if my dad were here especially, he'd get up and say, "Oh no, that's not how it happened," and try to give you his version of the story. But fortunately, you got to hear mine tonight, and George is here actually, so he can corroborate that I'm telling the truth. So, well, I think I'll read next some poems that I think some of you guys may have read in one of your classes called 10 Patients and Another. And often when I read these, folks will come up afterwards and say to me, "Oh, you know, towards the end you read these poems that really reminded me of that television show ER." And then, of course, the next question is, do you watch ER? And, of course, I have to kind of sheepishly admit, even now, that it's not, I'm still watching ER. It's embarrassing, but anyway. Especially so because, you know, so much of what's on that show actually resembles what I do every day in my work life. So you'd think I'd have other, better things to do. But actually, I want to say that I wrote these poems before ER was ever aired. And they were actually written in a very different sort of spirit, I think. I was trying in these poems to really actually give voice to some of the patients I've encountered in my own work. And I think sometimes on ER, the patients are really kind of just this sort of secondary issue, and the doctors are really, you know, the stars, and the patients just sort of exist so the doctors can work out all their complicated issues. So, so what I was trying to do here was actually to really dignify my patients and really give their narratives, in a sense, back to them, rather than trying to appropriate them, which is not only what happens, I think, on ER, but also actually in real medicine. That's one of the ways in which the show actually is, I think, accurate. And I think we often steal our patients' words in medicine, and certainly when we talk about their illnesses and talk about them, we do so in a way that I think really actually does the opposite and dishonors them, even though the intentions are good, I think. So this is a series of poems called 10 Patients and Another. and I'll read just a few of them. First one is Mrs. G. The patient is a 60-odd-year-old white female who presents with fever, cough, and shaking chills. No further history could be elicited. She doesn't speak. The patient's social history was non-contributory. Someone left her here. The intern on the case heard crackles in both lungs. An EKG was done, which showed a heart was beating in the normal sinus rhythm, except for an occasional dropped beat. An intravenous line was placed. The intern found a bruise behind her ear. She then became quite agitated and began to sob without producing tears. We think she's dry. She's resting quietly on Haldol, waiting for her bed upstairs. Jamal. The patient is a 3-year-old black male, the full-term product of a pregnancy that was, according to his grandmother, unplanned and may be complicated by prenatal alcohol exposure. Did okay, developmentally delayed but normal weights and heights, until last week when he ingested what's turned out to be cocaine, according to the lab results. His grandmother had said she'd seen him with some baby powder on his face and hands before he started seizing, and they brought him in. The vital signs have stabilized. The nurse is getting DSS involved. The mom? She left it on the kitchen table. That's her, the one who sings to him all night. Kelly. The patient is a 12-year-old white female. She's gravida 0, no STDs. She'd never even had a pelvic. 1 month, nausea and vomiting. No change in bowel habits. No fevers, chills, malaise. Her school performance has been worsening. She states that things at home are fine. On physical exam, she cried but was cooperative. Her abdomen was soft, with normal bowel sounds and question of a suprapubic mass, which was non-tender. Her pelvic was remarkable for scars at 6 o'clock. No hymen visible, some uterine enlargement. Pregnancy tests positive ×2. She says it was her dad. He's sitting in the waiting room. SW. Extending from her left ear down her jaw, the lac was 7 centimeters long. She told me that she slipped and struck her face against the kitchen floor. The floor was wet because she had been mopping it. I guess she'd had to wait for many hours since the clock read nearly midnight. Who mops floors so late? Her little girl kept screaming in her husband's thick, impatient arms. He knocked 3 times, each time to ask when we'd be done. I infiltrated first with lidocaine. She barely winced and didn't start to cry until the 16th stitch went in and we were almost through. I thought my handiwork was admirable. I yawned, then offered her instructions on the care of wounds. She left. Manuel. In Trauma 1, a gay Latino kid, I think he's 17, is getting tubed for respiratory failure. Sleeping pills and Tylenol, I translated for him as he was wheeled in. His novio explained that when he told his folks about it all, they threw him out, like trash. They lived together underneath the overpass of Highway 101 for 7 weeks, the stars obstructed from their view. For cash, they sucked off older men in Cadillacs. A viejita from the neighborhood brought tacos to them secretly. Last night, with 18-wheelers roaring overhead, he whispered that he'd lost his will to live. He pawned his crucifix to get the pills. regular AIDS admission. This one's great. They bring him in strapped down because he threw his own infected shit at them. You better bring your goggles. And a mask. We think he's got TB. He's pissed as hell. Apparently he wants to die at home, but somebody keeps calling 911. A relative back home in Iowa, or some damn place. Just keep him snowed with Ativan. Believe you me, you do not want to get to know this fucker. Capaci's all over, stinks like shit, incontinent of course. How long before you get down here? Because his nurse is driving me insane. Of course we got blood cultures. Yeah, a gas. Okay, I'll stick him one more time. The things you do for love. Jane Doe number 2. They found her unresponsive in the street. Beneath a lamplight, I imagined, made her seem angelic, regal even, clean. She must have been around 16. She died who knows how many hours earlier that day, the heroine inside her like a vengeful dream about to be fulfilled. Her hands were crossed about her chest, as though raised up in self-defense. I tried to pry them open to confirm the absence of her heartbeat, but in death she was so strong, as resolute as she was beautiful. I traced the track marks on her arms instead, then pressed my thumb against her bloodless lips. So urgent was my need to know. I felt the quiet left by a departing soul. Let's see here. I think I'll read maybe, I want to make sure we have time for some questions, so I'll just read maybe one more short passage of prose and then one last poem. I hope I've given you a little bit of a sense tonight of, I think, the importance of poetry in healing, not only in the day-to-day work of a physician like me, but also I think healing perhaps in a larger sense. I think it can be a very powerful tool for healing within communities and across communities when sometimes we encounter a lack of empathy in our lives, even when we're not working as physicians. So I thought I'd read again this short passage that maybe says a little bit more explicitly why I believe poetry and healing are linked. And this is from an essay called AIDS and the Poetry of Healing. It's just a couple paragraphs. In poetry are present the fundamental beating contents of the body at peace. The regularity of resting brainwave activity in contrast to the disorganized spiking of a seizure. The gentle ebb and flow of breathing or sobbing in contrast to the harsh spasmodic cough. The single-voiced ringing chant of a slogan at an ACT UP rally in contrast to the indecipherable rumblings of AIDS funding debate on the Senate floor. The poem is a physical process, is bodily exercise. Rhymes become the mental resting places in the ascending rhythmic stairway of memory. The poem perhaps is an idealization or a dream of the physical, the imagined healthy form. Yet it does not renounce illness. Rather, it reinterprets it as the beginning point for healing. I wonder then whether poetry might also be therapeutic. Many of my friends, especially my colleagues in medicine, have teased me for believing in the curative power of words, joking that I should write some doggerel on my prescriptions instead of the names of medications and directions for their use. If poetry is made of breath or the beating heart, then surely it's not unreasonable to think it might reach those places in the bodies of its audience, however rarefied. Moreover, I joke back, I have never seen a poem cause fulminant liver failure or bone marrow toxicity, even a really bad one. Putting the mouth to words, and by incantation returning regular rhythms to the working lungs, these were the principles by which ancient healers in Native American cultures practiced their art. The Egyptians gave their dead a book full of charms and spells to be used in the afterlife. Might not poetry then facilitate the passing to another realm? Poetry is a pulsing, organized imagining of what once was, or is to be. What life once was, what life is to be. It is ampules of the purest, clearest drug of all, the essence and distillation of the process of living itself. And so with that, I'll close with one last poem. Before I do, I want to thank Rico again for his very kind introduction, and thank all of you for coming out in this terrible weather to hear me read tonight. And I also want to dedicate this poem to the gay, lesbian, bisexual student group here and their allies. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me. This is a poem called What I Would Give. What I would like to give them for a change is not the usual prescription with its hubris of the power to restore, to cure. What I would like to give them, ill from not enough of laying in the sun, not caring what the onlookers might think while feeding some banana to their dogs. What I would like to offer them is this, not reassurance that their lungs sound fine, or that the mole they've noticed changed is not a melanoma, but instead of fear, transfigured by some doctorly advice, I'd like to give them my astonishment at sudden rainfall like the whole world weeping, and how ridiculously gently it slipped down my hair. I'd like to give them that, or the joy I felt while staring in your eyes as you learned epidemiology, the science of disease and population, the night around our bed, like timelessness, like comfort, like what I would give to them. Thank you very much. I hope you have some questions for me, or comments, or suggestions, or maybe an umbrella to lend me so I can get back to my car. What little hair I have left won't get slicked down anymore. No, but really, if you have any questions, I'd love to hear them and have a discussion. So that was my favorite part. Yes.
Actually, two. The first one is about iambic pentameter, which in her book, Rules of the Dance, Mary Oliver says is the closest flying unit to the actual inhalation and exhalation of the breath, so that by the time you're done, you have used a full breath. And I'm wondering if that has been part of your motive for using iambic pentameter so much in your work. And then the second thing I was hoping you talk about a little bit is your work with Derek Walcott and the ways in which he might have pushed your vision as a poet.
Well, the first question is about the relationship, if you will, of iambic pentameter to the innate rhythm of breathing, and I think that absolutely that's true in my own experience of working with iambic pentameter, and also spending a lot of my time at the other end of a stethoscope and listening to the ebb and flow of breathing, and also the iambs of the heartbeat as well. It's a very compelling rhythm, and I find that often, actually quite unconsciously, I'm writing an iambic pentameter or iambs without even sort of trying to, in this kind of effortless way perhaps that mirrors or reflects what I hear again in my patients' breathing and or in their heartbeats. And so I do believe actually that there is this sort of a fundamental connection between that particular rhythm and that particular line length and some of the rhythms of the body. And I know others have disputed that, but really I find again as someone who spends a lot of time listening to the body that really is a compelling kind of echo, if you will. And then as far as Derek Walcott's influence on me, any of you, if you know Derek, it's impossible not to be influenced by Derek, even after 5 minutes of being in the same room with him. But studying with him was absolutely tremendously eye-opening for me, and he really, I think, awakened me in many respects to some of the possibilities of writing about my own ethnic heritage, if you will, and really also writing about it in a way that was perhaps again new, the sense of the new world, and sort of challenging that with these traditional forms, and sort of running some of those experiences across these received forms, if you will, I think really provided, as it does, I think, in his work, who he's really the expert of this, so I feel a little inadequate speaking of my own efforts, but the sense that of putting pressures against those traditional forms and getting those forms to accommodate, this sort of mongrel or sort of new world hybrid experience, and I've really actually relished trying to do that in my own work, and it's one of the things I find most fascinating about Derek, who is a wonderful teacher, as I know you are. So. Embarrass the audience, that's always a good idea, right? Other questions, or anyone to leave screaming? Yes?
I have a question about Spanish. I know for Latino writers, the issue being between languages, depending on whether you're first generation, second generation, whatever. Sometimes first generation, parents spoke to you in Spanish, you answered in English.
Yes, exactly.
And how's that played out for you?
Yes. Well, it's a wonderful kind of collaboration, I guess I might say, in my mind between Spanish and English, and I often hear the sort of the rhythms or the undercurrents of Spanish as well, and as I'm trying to write, and so I think that there is a kind of communication there that does mirror the fact that I was often trying to mimic some of the wonderful musical qualities of the language I would hear, especially my grandparents speaking, and what I was trying to do in English, and really the sense of trying to at once master English, which was very important to me, that I be able to speak English in a really sort of masterful way, I guess, as an immigrant, as someone who didn't want to, in my youth, want to be perceived as different. And then again, this beautiful musical language that in some ways I was trying to salvage, at the same time I was trying to sort of suppress it. And so as it turns out, many of these received forms that so fascinate me come to us from Romance languages, and so I think also the attraction to some of these forms for me relates in some way to Spanish, which is actually much more rhyme-rich than in English, and so rhyming becomes challenging in English as compared to in Spanish, where it really is much easier to do. But that kind of challenge really does, I find that very gripping as well, and that's one of the reasons why I think I do persevere in form, although some people say, give it up, but so I've tried some different things too, but I can't, it's like an obsession, I have to admit, so that's a good question, thank you. Other questions? Or, yes?
At what point when you're thinking of writing something, do you decide this is going to be poem and this is going to be prose, or is there a moment when that happens?
Yeah, no, actually, that's, I write a fair amount in journals, and so sometimes it's really the sort of beginning shape of, a lot of it is just, sort of a context or a background, if you will, but oftentimes something does begin to take shape in a journal, and sometimes I find that something I'm writing is in some senses a poem, even as I first put it on the page, because I find that I've been sort of turning it over in my mind so much, like almost like a stone that gets polished in a riverbed or something, that I'm, through all the craziness of my days as a doc and all the 10 things I'm trying to do at once, and that somehow this poem has crystallized or has sort of come out of that, listening again to patients' narratives and stories, and then there are other times when it really, it just doesn't happen as a poem, and I think for me anyway, that decision, if it is a conscious one, it's actually probably an unconscious one for me, happens very early in the writing process. It's rare that I find myself trying to take something that is a chunk of prose and trying to shape it into a poem. Occasionally that happens where there's an idea that I really want to get into a poem, but then it often feels like I'm sort of shoehorning it in, and it often doesn't work. So that's a little bit about my own process. But, well, a follow-up question.
Well, it's sort of a follow-up, but you mentioned a stone being polished by a stream, and earlier somebody's going to get a lapidary, you said you'd explain that.
Oh, yes. Well, lapidary is gem-like, and I think in that particular poem I'm referring to my patient's eyes, which had this sort of brilliant sort of quality, because he was actually tearful as he overheard this colleague of mine talking about his, well, wasn't actually talking specifically about him, but about the hopelessness of taking care of people like him. And so those tears made his eyes seem like gems as I observed them at that particular moment. So that's why lapidary in that particular poem.
I'm curious, in recent years, hasn't Harvard Medical School introduced bedside manner classes, this kind of thing? And do any of those incorporate literature or poetry? And
Yes,
have
yes.
you taught anything like that?
Yes, I shouldn't sound so, it's terrible, but I guess I am one of the emissaries of teaching bedside manner at Harvard Medical School now. There are a few of us who are trying very desperately to get more into the curriculum in this area of what we call the medical humanities. And part of the problem is that change at Harvard Medical School, as at many places, is glacially paced. So that's a problem for anyone who wants to do anything new or innovative. And then also there's this problem that has to do with medical humanities itself as a discipline. It's as if we have, through the power of the biomedical model and all these tremendous scientific advances, kind of created a need now suddenly to actually teach humanness, which to me is sort of shocking. But more and more of the students that come to us for medical training are really scientists. They have very little interest or any little connection with actually working with people. They've often cloned a gene, or they've done all kinds of incredible scientific work, but they haven't read Dante, or they're very specialized even as they enter into medical training. And so we, I think, have created a kind of monster that needs this attention, and it is sad. And I can see sort of why some of my colleagues question, gee, how can you teach empathy, or that's such an alien concept, but yet again, with the dominance of the scientific model, if you will, the biomedical narrative of illness, where we reduce patients to, what does the CT scan say, what's the potassium level, what's the CD4 cell count, the breast cancer in room 712. I mean, we think of patients now in terms of the parameters of their illnesses, and that is chilling. And so I think we really do need the humanities as an explicit presence in medicine now, because of that. And that's not to say that science has not given us tremendous gifts that we can treat HIV now. I mean, I think of those poems I read and how far we've come in being able to treat people with HIV infection. I mean, what a wonderful thing that is. But yet, how at the same time we've forgotten about the humanity of those same patients, and that we are oftentimes very robotic and very distant in how we take care of them, or that we forget how people's points of origin, their cultural identities, their racial identities, their sexuality, all of these factors that make us who we are don't matter in medicine, and yet of course they do. We know that disparities in healthcare often have to do with some of these factors, and so there are many reasons why I think it's important to try to get that into the curriculum, and we are trying, and I'll tell you more about it afterwards if you want to hear more. Yeah.
Being of Latino descent, a doctor, being gay, being a poet, caring about your patients, do you ever feel like you're received negatively and that sort of thing?
Well, unfortunately, medicine, like the larger culture, is still, in some ways, I think, has a long way to go in terms of thinking about issues of diversity, and that gets back to this point about empathy that I tried to reflect in my poems, in that I think if we could be better at listening to each other, across these kinds of differences, And I always, when I was growing up, I thought, God, I am so cursed. I mean, I have all these identities that don't connect, and I have to deal with the homophobia of the larger culture, and then Latinos in some ways are even more homophobic, but not, and all these kind of complicated intersections. And I thought, this is just, I mean, how am I going to live my life? And then I found actually, again, through poetry and I think really literary writing in general, that there really are opportunities through the humanities to understand each other across these kinds of, what I think of ultimately as being pretty superficial kinds of differences, because, and really, taking care of patients as a doc has taught me that more than anything perhaps, in that, I see that people, no matter what their social class, no matter what their race, no matter what their sexual identity, we all suffer in the same way. We all experience ecstasy and joy in fundamentally the same ways. And our bodies are equally sort of flawed, imperfect in the same ways. And so I think that if we can think about empathy in some way as a larger culture, if we're willing to listen to that person who looks different from us or who acts differently, and whether it be through a poem, through music, through other artistic, creative self-expression, again, I think those are the best occasions for having that kind of connection. And so I think that while I have had some difficulties in representing myself for who I really am in the world, ultimately I think people, when they hear poetry, when they hear patients' narratives, they're able to see again this larger humanity that we all share. I don't know, maybe that's sort of naive to say in this sort of postmodern world where we're all fragmented and everything's so broken we can't ever fix it. But I really think that that there is tremendous hope, especially again through study of literature and the humanities in the larger sense. So I think that's a great question. Yes.
I had two questions. The first question was, you articulate so well the doctor-patient relationship in both your prose and your poetry. I was wondering if patient confidentiality ever comes up as a challenge or a problem. And the second is, just for curiosity, do you find that you do some of your best writing during work when you're on breaks, or do you get emotionally charged at something that affects you at work and feel the need to write it down?
Those excellent questions, and I think it's always really important to make clear that the patients who I describe in my work are in a sense kind of composites of many narratives, many stories, many people I've known, and I think it's very, very important that if I'm ever speaking about a specific patient, that I have asked that person's permission to write about them, or write about him or her, because I think the narratives really do ultimately, and in a very primary way, belong to them. And so the stories are not about me. I don't want to ever sort of exploit someone else's story to sort of aggrandize myself, that kind of thing. I think is really a very dangerous kind of impulse. And so the other thing that I'm often guided by is this sense that I want to tell stories, I want to tell narratives that often are not heard in the larger culture. And I think as long as I keep true to that impulse, that what I'm trying to do is honor the people who are silent, the people who are marginalized, the people who don't have a voice, that I think I'm doing something useful for them, that I'm doing something helpful, hopefully for all of us. And so I think that kind of guiding principle, which I always keep very much in the forefront of my mind when I'm writing, is also really sort of important and a kind of safeguard about what you're asking, which is, I think, really, again, a very important issue for anyone who is in this kind of privileged relationship with people who are suffering. And then as far as writing during work, I mean, I do think I do have sort of a kind of a process that is probably not very healthy, but I do incubate at work often, and I will occasionally write something down between breaks, but really the writing, the more focused writing I do happens away from that, and it's often a kind of a distillation of things that have happened over weeks or months, and not, again, it's rare where I find myself in an encounter with a specific patient, and I really feel, gosh, this specific narrative is so important that I really want to tell this specific story, and then of course, as I say, I would ask that person's permission. So those are really important ethical concerns, and I'm glad you brought that up. Yes.
I guess that question about confidentiality leads I was thinking, you said that no poem ever gave you any infection. But do you think there are hazards besides the one about the confidentiality, hazards to what you're doing? Do you think there's a way to do this wrong?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think that's another excellent question. And one of the things I'm always reminded to say in that vein is that there is also a kind of hubris, I think, about empathy or kind of a pitfall to empathy, which is the kind of attitude that I can know your experience of suffering because I'm so open-minded, I'm so empathetic that I can really know what I feel your pain, in that glib sort of phrase that we've heard. And I think that is actually really dangerous. That I never want to come across in my own work or to sort of spread a message that it's easy to know somebody else's experience of suffering, because when I talk about that mother in the emergency room with singing to her child who's ingested cocaine that she brought into the house, I can't ever know how she must feel, but I can perhaps try to give her a voice or represent that experience in a way that allows us all to enter into it to some extent, which I think is so much more important than simply the kind of the reflexive, either racist or classist or whatever kind of response we might have to that is the easy kind of response to that kind of scene, which I've witnessed countless times in my work, in my medical training. And so I think that that's really important, that there are bad ways to do this, and I think that just as the biomedical narrative can be arrogant in saying all that's important here is these data, it's also very important to recognize that these poems are a kind of really just an opening into an imaginative space. It's not, this is how these people felt. And even trying to convey my own feelings, very problematic. I can only, again, pose questions, I think, or make gestures. And ultimately, I think the experience of reading anyone's work is a kind of dialogue, an interaction between the speaker's voice and the reader, and what the reader brings to the experience. And so that's what I hope for in my own work, is that kind of, again, an opportunity for empathetic connection, but not a kind of a definition of suffering or a kind of explication of how somebody felt. So, but that's a great question. Yes, sir.
I think you have given voice very beautifully to the voiceless and expressed your values in the world of your experience. The question is, from the viewpoint of just testing your techniques and skills and so forth, do you write at all on non-medical issues or away from the field of empathy?
I've been trying to do a little bit more of that. I've been experimenting with some travel writing and some other kinds of writing that, again, more, as you say, to perhaps sharpen more my technical craft kinds of skills. And I think for any working writer, those are really important challenges. I would even admit publicly that I've been working on a novel for about 15 years, and that's a wonderful kind of sobering. Just as Rico was saying, reading poetry is a kind of good counterpoint to his fiction writing. I think my experiments in prose, which hopefully will never see the light of day, are actually a good kind of exercise in a sense for me. Not to at all belittle fiction writing, but again, it's a kind of it's a different mode and sort of fun to experiment in that realm, and so I may have a few more little tricks up my sleeve down the road, but probably I don't think that'll ever get published. But some of the other stuff, travel writing and other things. I think it's getting late. Do we have time for maybe one more question, or should we?
I'd like to encourage people to come and talk to Rafael, so you have time to sign